Tov, today's daf yomi is Nazir Samach Daled. We're going to start on the bottom of 63b, 4 lines from the bottom, where the Gemara is taught that the Mishnah had said that if a person goes into a cave and then he discovered a dead body floating there, that we're going to say that under those circumstances, since the body had been known, the person was tamei. If he wasn't sure if he touched it, he's still going to be tamei because it was a tumah yadua, it was a known tumah. So the Gemara says in today's daf yomi, the Gemara says, Safa, let's say that in general we're going to say, even though the dead body that was floating we said was tamei, but if it's Safa, ain't a matamel ain't sharets. Well, with respect to a rodent, there are 8 types of rodents, 8 types of creepy crawling creatures, not necessarily what we classify as rodents. We're not exactly sure how to identify all of them, but like a toad or a turtle, perhaps. So if this sheretz was floating in the water and you're not sure if you touched it, then we're not going to say, with respect to that, we're not going to say that you're tamei. We say that safek tumah, if it's floating in the water, is tumah by a dead body, but not by a sheretz. I was thinking about this concept of that if this floating tumah makes you tamei, I was thinking that we have to be aware of the energy that's floating around us in the air, that sometimes we could be impacted by the negative energy that's floating around us. So even if we're not necessarily 100% sure we're touching it, nevertheless, we're going to become tamei. So Safek Tumat Safa, as the Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah in Taharos, and it would change the Girsa from the Tanya to the Tanan. Safek Tuma, let's see, you're not sure if it's Tamei, that's Safa that's floating, and we're talking about a sheretz here. Bein Bekalim, Bein Bekarka, whether it's on a utensil, maybe the sheretz is floating on in a bowl, or bein bekarka, or whether it's floating directly on the water, we're going to say it's tahora. And we're going to say in those cases that if it's floating sheretz, it's tahora. Whereas Rabbi Shimon says, bekalim tameya bekarka tahora. He says, if it's floating in the water directly, it's tahora. But if it's floating on the utensil, then we're going to say it's like on the ground, and it's going to be tamei. It's not floating. So the Gemara says, my taima, the tanakama. What's the reason why the Tanakama says if it's floating on the water or even in a utensil on the water, we're going to say it's tahora? So Rav Yitzchak bar Avudimi. So Rav Yitzchak bar Avudimi taught ksiv, because one verse says b'chol hasharetz hasharetz, that we're going to become tamei with any creepy crawly creature. Kol makom shehu shoretz, any place where the creature is crawling, you're going to become tamei. But then it says v'ksev ala aretz, and then another verse says if it crawls on the earth, you're tamei. Ha'keitzad. So how do we deal with the apparent contradiction in the verses? Vaday mago tamei. That if it for sure touches it, we're going to say you are tamei. Safek mago, that if you're not sure if it touches it, so we say on the earth. Okay, it's a vaday mago tamei, safek mago tahor. That's what the Tanakama is saying. The Tanakama is saying that if you're certain you touched it, you're tamei. We don't care where it is, even on the water. You know you touched it. But if you're not sure if you touched it and it's floating on the water, then we're going to say you're tahor. That's why the Tanakama says, I don't care if it's in a utensil, if it's a safek mago, if you're not sure if you touched it, we'll say you're tahor. Rabbi Shimon, my time, and what's the reason why Rabbi Shimon draws a distinction? He says if it's in the utensil, we're going to always say it's tamei, even if it's if it's floating. If you're not sure if you touch it, we'll still say you're tamei. My time, it says in the verse, so part of the verse says you're tahor, another part says you're tamei with respect to carcass. So that's how the Rabbi Shimon learns the verse, that if it floats in a utensil, you're tamei, but on the water, we're going to say it's tahor. So Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught in the Brisa, anything that is being dragged or carried across the water, then we're going to say Sveikan Tameh. Even not necessarily even across water. If you're dragging it or carrying it and somebody else is not sure if they touched it, we're going to say that you're Tameh, because if it's being dragged or carried, it's like it's being placed on the ground. And so therefore, if you're not sure if the person touched it or not, another person touched it, we're going to say you're Tameh because it's like it was placed on the ground. On Nizrakin, whereas something where if something was thrown across this space, so therefore it's like floating in the air, Sveikan Tahor. Then we're going to say it's like floating in the air. And then if you're not sure if you touch it, you're Tahor, Chutz min Kazayas Hames, but it doesn't apply to an outsized portion of a dead body, Ma'amayel, Alpanei Tumah, where somebody covers over the Tumah. Those types of situations where we're going to say it doesn't apply, that the Sveiko about it was floating in the air and you have a doubt about it, we're going to still say you're Tameh. And also, it doesn't apply to anything that transmits tumah from above to below. Meaning, if you touch something above it, let's say there's a stack of things, and you touch something on the top, and the tumah thing is on the bottom, or vice versa, or milamata. That's how they transmit the tumah, and so therefore, this law of safek tumah, that we're lenient if it was thrown through the air, or if it's floating in the air, or if it's floating, doesn't apply to a dead body, doesn't apply to a zav or a zava. There we're strict. So by Rami Barachama, Meis Bekli, Vitzaf Alpanei. Well, let's say there's a dead body, piece of a dead body in a utensil, and the utensil is floating on the water. What do we say there? Mahu basar kliyas linan, basar misas linan. So what's the situation under this circumstances? So let's say there's a dead body in the utensil, and the utensil is floating on the water, and we're not sure if the person touched the tumah or not. Do we look at it as safek tumah, that we should be lenient, or not? So even though we learned in the Mishnah that if a Nazir is not sure if he touched the kazayis min hameis that's floating on the water, we're going to say it's tamei. That was only said when there was a doubt whether he was an oel on the meat, he covered over like a tent, because we said that tumas oel is not purified in the case of floating. But here we're talking about a case for sure he wasn't a tent over it. The question was whether or not he touched it, and whether or not you touch it, then we're going to say that there is a case of a doubt whether or not the floating tumah is going to be tahor or tummy. That's how the Mefarish explains it. So the dead body is in the utensil, and the utensil is floating on the water. Do we follow the utensil, and therefore we say it's like it's on the ground, or basar misazlin, or we follow the dead body, and it's like it's floating. If you want to say we follow the utensil, meisal gabe sheretz. Let's say the dead body is on one of these shmona shvatzim. It's one of these creepy, crawly creatures. Do we say kivin da'ai tumas erev ai tumas shiva? Do we say that they're fundamentally different types of tumah? The sheretz, you're going to be tummy only until evening, whereas the dead body, you have to wait 7 days with the ashes of the red heifer. Do we say command the mafto tumah b'kli damya, that we say it's like, since it's on something that's a fundamental difference between the dead body and the sheretz, that therefore we're going to view the dead body as though it's on a utensil, and therefore you'll be tummy if you're not sure if you touch it. Or maybe it's one thick piece of tumah, and therefore it's combined, and so therefore we're going to be lenient. Let's say tumah b'klida. I mean, so if you want to say it's like the utensil is like it's placing a utensil because it's on something different, it's on a sheretz, v'tamei, v'adai. And it's certainly tamei sheretz agabi nevela. Let's say the sheretz is on a carcass, and the nevela itself on the carcass is floating. Then what will be the case? Mahu, what will be the case there? Kimin de travail tumas erev. And do we say under these circumstances, since both the carcass and the sheretz are both, you're only tummy until the evening, you immerse in the mikvah, you're only tummy until the evening. Therefore, tumah samichtahi, therefore it's like one big giant tumah, and so therefore you can't rely upon this leniency that it's in. Therefore, it's floating in the air or floating in the water. Odoma hai kazais vai kadasha, or maybe since the carcass is like a kadasha, is like a olive, it becomes tummy like an olive, and the sheretz is like a lentil, and so therefore it's like it's in a separate utensil, and therefore you have to be strict. But if that's the case, sheretz agabi sheretz mahal. Let's say there's one sheretz on another sheretz. Do we say hane vade chachi or ninu? These are one entity together, since it's one amount, and therefore we can be lenient because it's like it's floating. Odoma giving them if or maybe since they're two separate beings, two separate creatures, it's like one is in another one, and therefore we'd be strict because it's on the ground. And if you want to say that it's sheretz on another sheretz, it's like it's placed in a utensil, and we're going to be strict. Sheretz al gabi nevela. Let's say you have a sheretz that's on a carcass. Sheni mocha, and it melted. What will we say? What will we say there? Kivan deni mucha havile mashka. Since it's melted, do we want to say it's like it's a liquid, and so therefore, it's like it's floating. Or do we say since it started off as a food item before it melted, it's like a food item, and therefore it's like it's in a utensil. You have to be strict. And if you say, well, it's like a food item, you have to be strict. It's like it's being placed in a utensil. Let's say it was on male seed. Let's say the sheretz is floating on the male seed. What do you say there? Do we say that the male seed is like a solid, and therefore it's like it's in a utensil, or it's floating like in a liquid? Or keeping them as aqua, since it left the body, therefore it's like food. Sheretz agabi mechatas. Let's say the sheretz is on the red heifers. Let's say the sheretz is on top of the red heifer's ashes. The red heifer's ashes were mixed with water. And that red heifers are floating. Red heifer's ashes are floating on the water. Or do we say it's like it's in a utensil? Or do we say it's like it's floating on the water? So Gemara says, teku. We don't know. Normally the Gemara doesn't say we don't know. It just says teku. Leave it unresolved. In this case, it says we don't know because the language of Nazir is Mishuna. Again, I thought to me that I'll just say this again. I said it at the beginning. I thought the compelling question here is we have to be aware of floating tumah, even though there are certain places we can be lenient, but also the bottom line is that in general we're strict. If there's a dead body that's floating in the water or in the air, we have to be strict with respect to it. We have to be restricted. The least severe forms of tumah we could be lenient if it's floating, but the most severe forms of tumah, even if it's just floating around us, we have to be careful that it can infect us and make us tamei. Okay, so now we come to the top of 64b. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Hamnuna, Nazir va'osa Pesach. So let's say we have a person who was a Nazarite, or we have a person who brought his carbon Pesach. Now, what happened? Here we had a person who was a Nazir, or a person who brought his carbon Pesach, and they had become tamei from a dead body, and they had sprinkled the ashes of the red heifer upon them on day 3 and day 7, and afterwards, after they had these ashes sprinkled upon them, they had walked over a grave which was buried in the depths. That was this tumah that was unknown, b'shvi shalan, on the 7th day. And they didn't know that they had walked over this grave, that they had theoretically become tamei, until after the Nazir had counted his Nazirus in Tahara and cut his hair, or after this person had brought the carbon Pesach. So basically, they had the ashes sprinkled upon them on day 7. And then after they had the ashes sprinkled upon them, they walked over this tumah tahom, this dead body that was unknown. Then they went ahead and they cut their hair or they brought the carbon pesach, and they didn't know that they were become tamei until after they did those things. So we're going to say they're tahorim, that they are tahor. And the Nazir does not mess up his Nazirus that he counted, and the person who brought the carbon pesach does not need to bring again the carbon pesach. My time, well, what's the reason? Delo alima tumas atahom or mistar. Tumas atahom is not strong enough. This unknown tumah is not strong enough to destroy your count, to destroy what you've done already, because you didn't know about this tumah until after the fact, until after you did the action, until after you did the action of shaving your hair from your carbon tumah, from your Nazirus in a state of tumah, or after you brought the carbon pesach. So Rava challenges this law. Masav Rava yard l'tayar mitumah sameis. Tamei, shecheskas, tamei, tamei, shecheskas, tar, tar. We said in our Mishnah in the law about the tumas tahom, and when can we say the leniency of tumas tahom? Only in a circumstance where you were in a state of ritual purity, where you were cheskas tahara. The presumptive status was you were tahora, but in this case you were still tameya. And so therefore, why can we rely upon the fact that the tumah of the tahom is not strong enough to destroy it? Here we said that since you're in presumptive status of tumah, the leniency of tumas tahom doesn't work. So Rav Hamnuna said back to Rava, Amar le mudinucha ben Nazir shemachusar tiglachas. He says, you know what? I'll agree with you that if the Nazir is not yet getting on his haircut, that we're going to say that under those circumstances he will lose his count. Meaning to say, there's a distinction between the case that Rav Hamnuna taught and the Nazir of the Mishnah. And the Nazir of the Mishnah has not yet got his haircut. He has not yet immersed in the mikvah. He's not yet got his haircut. So therefore, under those circumstances, we're going to say he's in the presumptive status of tumah. And so therefore, the tumas tahom is able to make him tamei. But the case of Rav Hamnuna, he's already cut his hair. And so therefore, he went out of the case of cheskas tumah, he's in a case of cheskas tahara. And so therefore, the tumas of the tahom does not make him tamei. So Amalei Rava, afanam modinocha ben Nazir ose pesach d'lo mechoser v'lo klum. So therefore, Rava says, you know what? I agree with you. Therefore, by the Nazir, I agree with you that by the case of the person who's bringing the carbon pesach, that since he doesn't have to do anything, once he immersed in the that he doesn't have to do anything, meaning to say that since he wasn't missing anything, once he missed in the, once he has had the ashes sprinkled upon him, meaning to say, since you're only saying your law in a situation where they already immersed and he cut his hair, he's not missing anything, and so therefore they're in a cheskas tahara, I'll agree with you that the tumas tahom does not make them tamei, and so too the carbon pesach, where he's already immersed, he doesn't need to bring another carbon pesach at that point. So Abaye says, but even the case of the Nazir and the carbon pesach, the carbon pesach is not going to be really complete until the sun sets. At that point, even if on day 7 he walks, even though he's immersed in the mikvah, he's still not complete with his actions, because he's really only purified once the nightfall comes that night. He has to wait for nightfall to come in order to eat the kachim. So therefore, he's not complete. So why don't we say that the tumah is going to make him, that the tumas tahom will make him tamei? So Rava says back to Abaye, no, that's not considered an action on his part, because Shimsha, the sun is going to set automatically. God created the world that the sun's going to set. Since the sun's going to set, we're not going to view it as an action that's deficient on his part. He set the wheels in motion. And also Abaye himself admitted that the fact that the sun didn't set is not considered an impediment. And as long as the person has immersed in the mikvah, even for on day 7 after the ashes of the red heifer, so at that point, even though if he walked over tumas tahom and then he brought a carbon pesach without knowing, even though he hadn't had the sunset when he walked over the tumas of tahom of the dead body, we're still going to say he completed all the actions and he's in a cheskes tahara. The Tanya and the Gemara is going to cite a proof that Abaye reversed himself from the following brisa that deals with a woman who gave birth. So we know that after a woman gives birth, that for the first 14 days she's not allowed to be with her husband, and then the next 66 days she is what's called dam tahara, dam tohar, that the blood is going to be ritually pure. So she's allowed to be with her husband, but she can't eat kachim until after 80 days when she brings the carbon. So then she's no longer mechusar kippurim when she brings the carbon on day 81. So we learned in this brisa that, let's say a woman gave birth and then afterwards she had a miscarriage. If she had a miscarriage, yom muloos, on the last day of her, let's say on day 80, then she has to bring an additional carbon, tavi. Meaning, say, if she had it on day 81, after she already completed her days of that she has to wait before bringing the carbon, then she's going to have to bring 2 carbonos. Toch malos, but let's say she brought it within the 80 days, then lo tavi, then she doesn't bring 2 carbonos because it was still part of the same span. But I might think that she doesn't bring a carbon that if she has a miscarriage within the 80 days, but if she has one after the 80 days, meaning let's say she has her first miscarriage at 70 days, so then she still has to wait longer, and then the second miscarriage happens day 90, so it's after the first 80-day count, but she's still within the period of Tumah. So I might think under those circumstances, she brings 2 sets of sacrifices. That only if she brings it if she has a miscarriage on day 81, then she brings 2 sacrifices. But if she has it on day prior to that, before she becomes purified, she only brings one sacrifice. And Rav Kahana says, what's the reason that when she has a second miscarriage, even if it was after day 81, but it's before she had been purified, we're going to say that it's considered like within the first birth, and she only has to bring 1 sacrifice. Deshane hacha, the michzra carbon, because when she has the second miscarriage, she still has not reached the point where she's bringing a sacrifice for her first one, and so therefore it's still within the first sacrifice. And the Gemara explains, the Gemara challenges Rav Kahana, Hasam Nami, but there too, Michasra Erev Shemesh. In the first brisa, where if she had it on, in the first case, where she had the miscarriage on day, where she had the miscarriage on day 81, even though she had gone to the mikvah and brought the sacrifices, she's still missing the sun setting. So why do we say there that she has to bring 2 sets of sacrifices? She's still missing the sun setting on that day if it's on day 81. Even though she's gone to the mikvah, she's still missing the sun setting. So the Gemara says, so that case too, Abaye gives the answer which they had given to Abaye before, which Rav had given to Abaye before, that since the sun was going to set, we're not going to consider that she's missing anything as part of her purification. That the sun setting on its own is not considered like she's missing something. So now we say the next Mishnah, let's say a person finds a dead body. So what's the reason this Mishnah has nothing to do with the previous one, except for the fact that it refers to the case called Raglayim Ladavar. That was a phrase that we used in the last Mishnah, that there's legs to the matter. There's some evidence to support this argument. So since that phrase appeared, we're going to use the phrase again in this context. Let's say you find the dead body, and you find it for the first time, and it's buried in a manner which is typical that the Jews were buried, on their back with their hands folded over. Then, since we assume it was only one body found by itself, we assume that it wasn't meant to be buried there. So therefore, you could move the dead body. When you move the dead body, you have to take some earth along with it. Shnayim, also, if you find 2 dead bodies, notlon that tfusasan, you can move the body of this Jew. But matzah shlosha, if you find 3 dead bodies, then all of a sudden we have to be concerned that maybe it's a cemetery and then you can't move the dead body. You're only allowed to move a body from a cemetery to kever avos if it's for the graves of the father, meaning to a family graveyard, or to Eretz Yisrael. So in Yesh Ben Zel Azeh, so if you find three graves together, we're going to assume in Yesh Ben Zel Azeh Midal Amos Vatshmona Amos. If there is between the graves from 4 cubits to 8 cubits, then we're going to say Arezeh Shlunas Kavaros. Then it's a cemetery, and then you can't move the bodies anymore. So that's the point. That's a cemetery. But and once you've established a cemetery, you search from there onward 20 amos, esrim amma. If you find one, so then we're going to assume it's a cemetery. So anything within 20 amos of there is another dead body. Even if you find one grave at the end of 20 amos, you assume it's part of the cemetery. Then you keep searching another 20 amos. That even though there are 20 amos from 20 amos away from each other, we're going to assume that they're all part of the same cemetery. Because if you have found it initially like that, you could have moved it. But now that we find him, once we've established a cemetery, we're going to assume that the cemetery, anything that's included within 20 amos of that cemetery is part of that cemetery. And that's the halacha. Okay, so that's our Mishnah. We'll stop the recording here. But actually, we could go on a couple more minutes.